Well, we've reached Book 2 of Visits from the World of Spirits, or Interesting Anecdotes of the Dead. I'm not going to read the full title this time. If you've been following along in episodes 1 and 2, you know the full title is a very hefty word count, so we're going to use the abridged version from now on. Book 2, this section is called Showing that Unembodied Spirits Are Allowed by a Supernatural Power to Assume to Themselves the Shape, Air, Dress, and Deportment they formerly carried in the world. I hadn't really ever thought about this question. Do ghosts dress the same? Do they wear the same clothes that they wore when they were alive? I guess so. I guess it makes sense, now that I think about it. An important detail to nail down here. So let's read about it. No more interruptions, I promise. Chapter 1. Mrs. Bargrave's visit to Mrs. Veal at Canterbury. A woman's appearance to her son at sea. A divine sees his own apparition. Ghost of Mrs. Breton for the recovery of some lands to the poor. Mrs. Margaret Veal and Mrs. Mary Bargrave, before her marriage called Lodowick, had contracted a great intimacy in their younger years, at which time the father of one was customer, and that of the other minister of Dover. This friendship, as it served the true ends, was of use to Mrs. Veal in one particular, for when her father by his extravagance had reduced his family, she found a seasonable relief from it in her necessity. Besides this, Mrs. Bargrave was instrumental to her better fortune, for by her interest with a gentleman, one Mr. Boyce, her relation, Mrs. Veal's brother was recommended to Archbishop Tillotson, by whom he was introduced to Queen Mary, and her Majesty, for his relation by the mother to the Hyde family, gave him the post of Comptroller of the Customs at Dover, which he enjoyed to his death. This is a part into which Mrs. Bargrave is loath to enter, being reduced to it by the treatment she had met with from Mr. Veal, who, to invalidate the story of his sister's appearance, would make the world believe she had little or nothing of her acquaintance. Time and alteration of circumstances on either side had interrupted their friendship for some years, and Mrs. Bargrave, by being half a year in London, and afterwards settling at Canterbury, had neither seen nor heard from her a year and a half. Mrs. Veal, some time before her death, had the addresses of a gentleman of the army, Major General Cyborg, a natural son of the Duke of Scomberg, since killed in the Battle of Mons, and was engaged so far that her brothers not consenting to it is believed to have brought on those fits which were the cause of her death. She died at Dover on Friday in the month of September, 1705. On Sunday, a little before 12 in the morning, Mrs. Bargrave, being by herself in her own house in Canterbury, at which time she had been reflecting on her misfortunes, and comforting herself with better hopes, as she was taking her work in her hand, heard somebody knock at the door, and going out, to her astonishment, found it to be her old friend Mrs. Veal. After expressing her surprise to see so great a stranger, she offered to salute her, which the other declined, as it were, by hanging down her head and saying she was not well, on which Mrs. Bargrave desired her to walk in and sit down, which she did. An apparition, as one has observed, is a restless disembodied spirit, and although it appears to have its own natural body, clothes, etc., yet it will never suffer itself to be touched by any it appears to, which plainly shows that an apparition is only an airy phantom or spirit, which can vanish out of sight. Why God sometimes permits such things we cannot tell, though generally it appears to be for some good purpose, either respecting the person they appear to, or some others, and perhaps to ease their own disquieted spirit, which cannot rest until it hath revealed to some the cause of their uneasiness. She was dressed in a silk, dove-colored riding gown, with French night-clothes. She appeared expressly the same without alterations, and Mrs. Bargrave remembers to have heard her steps distinctly as she walked in. Mrs. Bargrave began by asking where she was going in that dress. She answered she was going her journey, which the other took to be Tunbridge, where she went every year for the benefit of her health, and said, "You are going to the old place." Mrs. Veal, being never trusted abroad without attendance upon account of her fits, she asked how she came alone from her uncle's, meaning one Captain Watson in Canterbury, with whom she always lodged. She replied she had given them the slip to see her. She then asked how she came to find her out in such a house, being reduced by her husband's extravagance to take up with a much smaller one than she had been wont to have done. To which the other made answer, she should find her out anywhere. Mrs. Bargrave's husband was a barrister at law, a man who spent all in excesses, and as he was the worst of husbands, his wife had gone through a long course of ill usage, which was in a great measure unknown to the world. The use of this is to show one end of Mrs. Veal's visit, which seems to be to give her the relief they had often communicated to each other in the course of their friendship. Mrs. Veal then began with Mrs. Bargrave by asking her what was the matter with her, she looked so ill. She replied she had been thinking on her misfortunes. "I must now act the part you did to me under my misfortunes," says Mrs. Veal. "I must comfort you as you used to do me. I would have you by no means think that God Almighty is displeased with you, but that his intention is only to try and perfect you. For God does not afflict willingly, nor grieve the children of men. Besides, one moment's happiness of the other world will be more than a reward for all your sufferings, when, as upon a hill, you shall be above all the storms and dangers of a troublesome world. We are now in the dark as to a great many of God's dispensations, but we shall then see a perfect harmony in them all." She went on a great way in this manner, with unusual vehemence, and striking her hand often on her knees, she cried, "You must believe it." Mrs. Bargrave, being so earnestly pressed, asked if she did not think she believed it, to which she replied, "No doubt but you do, but you must believe it thoroughly." Mrs. Bargrave, moved with the discourse, chanced by a turn of her chair to throw down from a shelf Drelincourt's treatise of the Christian's defense against the fears of death, which gave the first hint to tell her there was Drelincourt they had so often read together. "I see," says Mrs. Veal, "you keep on your old way of reading, which, if you continue to do, will not fail to bring you to the happy condition he speaks of." The other, mentioning Dr. Sherlock and some others on that subject, she said Drelincourt had the clearest notions of death, and that neither Dr. Sherlock nor any other on that subject were comparable to him, as she expressed it, to her understanding. "Dear Mrs. Bargrave," says she, "if the eyes of our faith were but as open as the eyes of our bodily senses, we should see innumerable angels about us for our guard, but our notions of heaven are nothing like what it is, as Drelincourt says. Believe me, my dear friend, one moment of future happiness will be more than amends for all your suffering, nor yet can I believe that God will suffer you to spend all your days in this afflicted condition. But be assured your sufferings will leave you, or you them, in a short time. Therefore be comforted under them, and be assured that God Almighty has a particular regard for you, that they are marks of his favor, and when they have done the business they were sent for, will be removed." Mrs. Bargrave, speaking how dark such a condition as hers was, that had no alloy at present, she said at the worst these storms would be recompensed by the reception she would meet with in her father's house. And from the 57th of Isaiah, that God would not contend forever, nor be always wrath, for the Spirit should sail before him, and the souls which he had made. Mrs. Bargrave's husband, dying about 2 years after that event, made her reflect on this part of her discourse, as pointing to her deliverance. In the course of conversation, Mrs. Veal entered upon the subject of friendship, and saying there was now little friendship in the world, the other replied she hoped she herself had no reason to complain, everyone being a friend to the rich. "I mean," says Mrs. Veal, "such a friendship as you and I had to improve one another in what is useful." Mrs. Bargrave, mentioning Dr. Horneck's treatise, where he treats of the lives of the primitive Christians, Mrs. Veal went on to recommend their example, saying that their conversation was different from that of the present age, which is made up of nothing but vain, frothy discourse. Theirs was to edification, to build up one another in faith. Theirs was a hearty friendship, but where is it now to be found? It is hard indeed, says Mrs. Bargrave, to find a friend in these days. What did you think of my friendship, says Mrs. Veal, which I'm sure has not at all answered what I owe you. If you can forgive me, you are the best-natured creature in the world. Says Mrs. Bargrave, do not mention such a thing. I have not had an uneasy thought about it. I can forgive you. But what did you think of me, says Mrs. Veal. I thought of you, says Mrs. Bargrave, that, like the rest of the world, prosperity had altered you. I have been, says Mrs. Veal, the most ungrateful wretch in the world, and then recounted many of the kindnesses she had received from her in her adversity, saying, she wished her brother knew how she was troubled about it. Being asked why she did not acquaint her brother of it, if it was such a trouble to her, she said she did not think of it till her coming away. To divert the discourse, Mrs. Bargrave asked her if she had seen a copy of verses of Mr. Norris's on friendship in a dialogue between Damon and Pythias. She said she had seen other parts of his works, but not that. Says Mrs. Bargrave, I have them of my own writing, and the other desiring to see them, she went upstairs and brought them to her to read. But Mrs. Veal said, it is your own scrawl. Pray read it yourself. Holding down my head will make it ache. So Mrs. Bargrave read them. There was a passage that friendship survives after death, which the other desired to have repeated, and said, Mrs. Bargrave, these poets call heaven by a strange name, that is, Elysium, and added with a particular emphasis, that their friendship should have no end in a future world. There are some, says she, who are apt to deny women to have any souls, and make it a thing indifferent whether they are of any religion or no, but we shall be found to have souls as well as men, and are not a little obliged to a certain divine, who is of opinion that they shall make the greater number of the happy. Some discourses they had upon charity, with respect to our differences in religion, as to which, she said, people had but little religion while they talked so much about it, and were so little influenced by it in their temper and practice, and when they were all going to heaven, were to blame to fall out by the way. This part of their discourse lasted near an hour and a half, which at this distance of time is not to be expected that it should be entire and perfect. As the conversation was upon the usual subjects, so it was in the usual manner, part in French and part in English, all which time Mrs. Bargrave observed nothing particular of her, but the vehemence of her discourse. When she looked earnestly at her, she rubbed her eyes, and asked if her fits had not quite altered her senses, to which Mrs. Bargrave replied that she thought she never saw her look better in her life. Mrs. Veal then asked her what was become of her husband, and being told he was abroad, said she wished he might not come home while she was there, for though he had always treated her with respect, yet she had sometimes been frighted with his frolics. Mrs. Bargrave then asked if she would drink tea. I warrant you, says she, this madman has broke all your trinkets, but the other said she would get something to drink in for all that. I will, says she, if I want it. At last, she said, she had great apprehensions of her fits, and that, in case she should die of them, desired Mrs. Bargrave to write to her brother and tell him she would have him do such and such things, viz., give her best clothes to her Uncle Watson's daughter, as also 2 small pieces of gold laid up in a cabinet in a purse, so many pieces to another person, 2 rings to Mr. Breton, Commissioner of the Customs, a ring to Major General Cyborg, of which Mrs. Bargrave sent him a letter, and further desired to charge her brother not to take any interest of such a person she had a kindness for, whose plate she had in security. As she often pressed this message, the other as often declined it, saying it would be disagreeable to trouble such a young gentleman as her brother was with their conversation, that he would wonder at her impertinence, and that she had better do it herself. To which she replied that though it might seem impertinent now, she would see the reason of it hereafter, that her brother, though a sober man, and free from other vices, was yet vain, which she desired her to tell him, as also of their discourse, and to give her credit, told her some secret of consequence between him and herself. Seeing her so importunate, Mrs. Bargrave fetched pen and ink, upon which the other said, "Let it alone till I am gone, but be sure that you do it." This kind of discourse gave Mrs. Bargrave apprehensions of her fits, so that she drew her chair close to her to prevent her from falling, during which she several times took hold of the sleeve of her gown, which Mrs. Veal told her was scoured the second time, and Mrs. Bargrave commended it for a pretty silk. Mrs. Veal said she had better take it for herself. The other answered, "You are going a journey, how will you do without it?" She said, "As well as you, who have often taken off your gown from your back to me." Towards the latter end of this discourse, she told Mrs. Bargrave that she had received a pension of £10 a year from Mr. Breton, Commissioner of the Customs, who she said had been her great friend and benefactor. She asked Mrs. Bargrave if she knew her sister, Mrs. Hazelwood, who, she said, was coming to see her as she was taking her journey. The other asked again how she came to order matters so strangely. She said the house was ready for them. It proved that Mrs. Hazelwood and her husband came to her house just as she was dying. By this time she began to look disordered, and forgetful of what she had said, as if the fits were coming upon her, which was like the acting a part to take away the suspicion of death. As this visit seems in a great measure designed out of gratitude to a friend without giving any apprehensions, so the several parts of her discourse, that relating to Mr. Breton's pension, her sister Hazelwood, the scouring her gown, the quantity of gold in the purse, the rings, and the plate in pawn, are designed as credentials to her brother and the world. At last she asked Mrs. Bargrave, "Where is Molly?" meaning her daughter. She replied, "She is at school, but if you have a mind to see her, I will send for her," to which the other agreeing, she went to a neighbour's house to send for her, and at her return found Mrs. Veal without the door of her house in readiness to be gone. Mrs. Veal asked if she would not go with her, which the other took to be Captain Watson's in Canterbury, and said, "You know it as much as my life is worth, but I will see you tomorrow in the afternoon, after sermon." "But why are you in such a haste?" Mrs. Veal then said, "In case you should not come, or should not see me, you will remember what I have said to you." She saw her walk off till she came to the turning of a corner, and then lost sight of her. It was market day, and immediately after the clock struck 2. Mrs. Bargrave at that instant told a neighbour of Mrs. Veal's visit, and the matter of their conversation, and a neighbour's servant from a yard near her window heard some of their discourse, and being asked by her mistress if Mr. Bargrave was talking with his wife, made answer that they never talked of anything so good. At night her husband came home in a frolicsome humour, and taking her by the hand, said, "Molly, you are hot, you want to be cooled," and so opening the door to the garden, put her out there, where she continued all night, at which time she thinks it a mercy she had no apprehensions about Mrs. Veal's apparition, which if she had, it probably would have cost her her life. All Sunday she kept her bed in a downright fever, and on Monday morning sent to Mrs. Watson's to inquire after Mrs. Veal, and as she could have no satisfaction, went herself and had as little. They were surprised at her inquiring for Mrs. Veal, and said they were sure by her not seeing her that she could not have been at Canterbury. But when Mrs. Bargrave persisted that she was, and described her dress, saying she had on a scoured silk of such a colour, Mrs. Watson's daughter said that she had indeed seen her, for none knew of the gowns being scoured but themselves, and that her mother helped to make it up. In the meantime Captain Watson came in, and told them that preparation was making in town for the funeral of some person of note in Dover. This quickly raised apprehensions in Mrs. Bargrave, who went away directly to the undertaker's, and was no sooner informed it was for Mrs. Veal, but she fainted away in the street. For a long time she was hurried with crowds of all kinds of people, who came far and near to gratify their curiosity, the most skeptical on one hand and the most superstitious on the other, and during her husband's lifetime she was most unmercifully exposed to his raillery. Mr. Veal, to save the legacies, or out of an imaginary regard to his sister's character, would have bantered off the matter by saying that Mrs. Bargrave had but little of his sister's acquaintance, and that the gold said to be in his sister's cabinet was in another place. This obliged Mrs. Bargrave to send him a letter by a gentleman she could trust, to be delivered before witnesses, and with the exactness to write in what manner it was sealed. In this, among other things, was communicated the secret delivered by Mrs. Veal, which though at present it put him into a great passion, yet obliged him to pay the legacies. From that time, whether from a fright he had one night, as she was informed by his servants, or however else, he would not lie without servants in his room, and though he had declared before against marrying, yet married in 6 weeks. His evasions were so frivolous to Dr. Stanhope, Dean of Canterbury, that when he endeavoured to make the doctor disbelieve the story, and the doctor pressed him how she should come to know so much of her secret affairs, to divert the argument of her appearing after her death, he owned his sister could conceal nothing from her, intimating she might have told her in her lifetime. He was so piqued at the doctor that when he came to Canterbury to be married by him, he was married by another, nor was he ever able to encounter Mrs. Bargrave, but industriously avoided her. Mrs. Bargrave was a person who had had the education of a gentlewoman, of a great share of modesty and good sense, and a temper so little given to fancies that none could have more contempt for the common weaknesses of this kind. She said she should have laid this to imagination if it had not been by day, attended with so long and particular conversation, at a time when she knew no other than that the person was living, and was under no sort of apprehensions. But as it was, she could not give up her reason and her senses in compliance with such as would have it she had been in a dream. Such as knew her many years, and could be trusted as to her character, said she was a person who had all the reality of religion, with the easiness that became it, of which she had given substantial proofs in her life, so that her fidelity would take off any suspicion of her inventing such a story, whatever end or advantage might have been proposed by it, when, as the case was, there could be none. It is true, things of this kind are beset with difficulties of a very hard solution, but if we consider how many things there are abroad in nature, and even in ourselves, the manner of which is no less hard to be explained, and yet no one is so skeptical as to deny their being, upon the evidence of a fact so fairly attested, a man may be induced to believe it without any risk of his understanding, nor is any consequence to be raised against things of this nature from the numberless weak and fanciful stories of apparitions. It may be safely said that the one is no more affected by the other than true miracles are by what the Holy Scriptures call lying wonders, i.e., sorcery or legerdemain, the sleight of magic, or the impostures of Rome. One thing has much contributed to sink the credit of the story, with many who have known it no otherwise, and that is its being published in a new edition of Drelincourt's treatise of the Christian's defense against the fears of death, by the accident mentioned of that book's falling into the subject of conversation, and being preferred by Mrs. Veal. The bookseller, to promote the sale of his book, printed it with such an account of the story as he had picked up, which is not only most wretchedly confused and imperfect, but fails in most particulars, and this makes the thing itself in a great measure pass for a trading story. Mrs. Bargrave, who was not forward to propagate a thing by which she never got anything but trouble, was so offended at the bookseller's publishing it as he did, that she could not forbear rallying him on that subject. But the thing has a better authority than that of the bookseller, by whom, as it never received, so can it never lose credit with such as have a better information. Nor does the matter so altogether rest on Mrs. Bargrave's testimony, but it may speak for itself, for besides that the story was communicated while Mrs. Veal was supposed to be living, it is impossible that such an invention could be made so consistent with itself, and the circumstances attending it, as not to be detected in time, either through some slip of the contriver, or the appearance of inconsistency in facts, whereas Mrs. Bargrave never deviated from her account, nor has time, and the general curiosity which stories of such consequence must raise ever produced anything to discredit it. Only Mr. Veal would have it that the gold said to be in his sister's cabinet was in another place, but as ill humour had so much the better of him in another instance, it may be liable to suspicion in this case. The appearance of the ghost of Mrs. Breton for the recovery of some lands to the poor, in a narrative sent to Dr. Moore from Edward Fowler, prebendary of Gloucester, and afterwards bishop of that diocese, from Dr. Sinclair's Invisible World. Dr. Breton, late rector of Ludgate and Deptford, living formerly in Hertfordshire, was married to the daughter of Dr. S. This gentlewoman was a person of extraordinary piety, which she expressed as in her life so at her death. She had a maid for whom she had a great kindness, who was married to a near neighbor, whose name was Alice. Not long after her death, as Alice was rocking her infant in the night, she was called from her cradle by a knocking at the door, which opening she was surprised as the sight of a gentlewoman not to be distinguished from her late mistress, neither in person nor habit. She was in a mourning gown, the same to appearance with that she had often seen her mistress wear. At first sight she expressed very great amazement, and said, "Were not my mistress dead, I should not question but that you were she." She replied, "I am the same that was your mistress," and took her by the hand, which Alice declared was as cold as a clod. She added that she had business of great importance to employ her in, and that she must immediately go a little way with her. Alice trembled, and besought her to excuse her, and entreated her very importunely to go to her master, who must needs be more fit to be employed. The spectre answered that he who was her husband was not at all concerned, but yet she had a desire rather to make use of him, and in order thereto had several times been in his chamber, but he was still asleep, nor had the power to do more than once uncover his feet, towards the awakening him, and the doctor said he had heard walking in his chamber of a night, which till now he could not account for. Alice next objected that her husband was gone a journey, and she had no one to look to her child, and that it was very apt to cry vehemently, and she feared if it awaked before her return, it would cry itself to death, or do itself a mischief. The spectre replied the child should sleep till her return. Alice, seeing there was no avoiding of it, sorely against her will, followed her over a stile into a large field, who then said to her, "Observe how much of this field I measure with my feet." And when she had taken a good, large, leisurely compass, she said, "All this belongs to the poor, it being gotten from them by wrongful means," and charged her to go and tell her brother, whose it was at that time, that he should give it up forthwith, as he loved her and his dear aged mother. This brother was not the person who did this unjust act, but his father. She added that she was the more concerned because her name was made use of in some writing that related to this land. Alice asked her how she could satisfy her brother that this was no cheat or delusion of her fancy. She replied, "Tell him this secret, which he knows that only himself and I are privy to, and he will believe you." Alice having promised to go on this errand, she proceeded to give her good advice, and entertained her all the rest of the night with heavenly and divine discourse. When twilight appeared, they heard the whistling of carters and noise of horse bells, whereupon the spectre said, "Alice, I must be seen by none but yourself," and then disappeared. Immediately Alice makes all haste home, being thoughtful of her child, but found it as the spectre had said, asleep as she left it. When she had dressed it and committed it to the care of a neighbor, away she went to her master the doctor, who, amazed at the account she gave him, sent her to his brother-in-law. He, at first hearing Alice's story and message, laughed at it heartily, but she had no sooner told him the secret, but he changed his countenance, and told her he would give the poor their own, and accordingly did so, and they now enjoy it. This, with more circumstances, had been several times related by Dr. Breton himself, who was well known to be a person of great goodness and sincerity. He gave a large narrative of this apparition of his sister to my two friends, first to one Mr. Needham, and afterwards, a little before his death, to Dr. Witchcott. About 40 years afterwards I received the foregoing narrative. I fell into company with 3 sober persons of good rank, who all lived in the city of Hereford, and I travelled in a stage-coach 3 days with them. I related this story, but was told it was done at Deptford, for so I presumed it was, because I knew that there Dr. Bretton lived. They told me as soon as I had concluded it that the story was very true in the main, but only I was out as to the place, for it was not at Deptford, but as I remember, they told me at Pembridge, near Hereford, where the doctor was minister, before the return of the king, and they assured me upon their own knowledge that to that day the poor enjoyed the piece of ground. They added that Mrs. Bretton's father could never endure to hear anything of his daughter's appearing after death, but would still reply that it was not his daughter, but the devil, so that he acknowledged something appeared in the likeness of his daughter. This is attested by me, 17th February, 1681, Edward Fowler. A mother's appearance to her son while at sea. A woman who lived on Rhode Island in America, whilst on her deathbed, and just before she expired, expressed a great desire of seeing her only son, who was then a mariner, navigating in the West India seas, and of delivering him a message. She informed the persons near her what she wanted to say to her son, and died immediately. About that instant she appeared to him, as he was standing at the helm, it being night and bright moonshine. She first appeared on the shrouds, and delivered her message, and afterwards walked over some casks that lay on the deck, then descended the side regularly to the water, where she seemed to float for a while, and at last sunk and wholly disappeared. The young man immediately set down the time and day and the substance of her message, and found, on his arrival at Rhode Island, that she died at the very juncture when she was seen by him, and that the words she spake to him corresponded exactly with those she delivered to the persons around her. This young man had soon after the misfortune to be drowned at sea. Perhaps her appearing to him and sinking in the water was a forerunner not only of her own, but of his death. A young woman, who lived on the north side of Long Island in the state of New York, with a magistrate, went on a visit about 18 miles to the south side of the island, and while she was absent, she appeared to her master and mistress as they were in bed. The magistrate spoke to her, asked her if she got safe home, and she vanished immediately. She returned home soon afterwards, and was taken ill of a fever, of which she died in a few days. A clergyman in America sees his own apparition. A clergyman who lived in the Massachusetts, and had entertained an opinion for more than 50 years that such stories were only the vapors of distempered and weak brains, was convinced at last in the following manner. Being in his own garden, he saw his own likeness or apparition, dressed just as he then was, pass by him, and look him full in the face. He ran into the house in a great surprise, told his family what he had seen, that he was convinced of his former error, and that he feared he should live but a few days. His words proved true, for he died a short time after. Both these stories are related upon the testimony of an eminent physician. So, that was Chapter 1 of Book 2. Some interesting last few stories there. And I guess now we're satisfied that ghosts can appear with the same clothes that they used to wear in life. Chapter 2 looks like it's just 2 stories. But they're rather long, so we'll just read through this and then we'll be done for the night. Should take us around a half hour. Here we go. Chapter 2. A true and remarkable account of the apparition of a minister to a young lady, reproving her conduct respecting an unlawful amour, apparition to a wicked mother-in-law, and others, to preserve an estate to the right heir. A true and remarkable account of the apparition of a minister to a young lady, reproving her conduct respecting an unlawful amour. A certain young lady of Wilts, born in the county of Bedford, had long been courted by a young gentleman whose father had a very good estate in the same town, but she had kept him company too openly, yet had not yielded to his importunities respecting a criminal conversation. though her reputation suffered as much as if she had. But at length she was so far over-persuaded that she made an appointment to be at such a time at a farmer's house, a tenant of his father's, and who was, it seems, let into the wicked secret. Accordingly, she dresses herself up with the best of her art to recommend herself to the devil, I may say, and away she goes to meet him, having her servant maid to attend her, because it was over some fields that she was to go. When she came near the house, she found some excuse or errand to send her maid back again to the town, the wench, it seems, not being privy to the business. As she was about to dismiss her maid, the maid offered to go farther till she was nearer the house, but her mistress, seeing the minister of the town coming along the path, and making that the excuse, "Oh," says she, "there's our minister, Dr. Blank, coming, so I shall have his company. You may go back, Mary. I shall be safe enough." The maid, seeing the minister also, immediately returned back as desired. As soon as the minister came up to her, he gave her the usual compliment, and asked her how she came to be in the fields alone. She answered she had not been alone, having sent back her maid the sooner on seeing him coming, and besides, says she, I am going but to yonder house, mentioning the farmer's name. "Oh, madam," says the doctor, "are you going thither? Then I know your errand." She was surprised and blushed, but recovering a little, "What errand, sir?" says she. "Why, madam," says he, "it may not be proper for me to name the business, but you know it well enough." "What do you mean, sir?" says she. "I don't understand you." "Why," says he, "your favorite, the young squire, is there before you." She was terribly surprised then, and could scarcely speak to him, being touched with shame and indignation, supposing the young gentleman had boasted of her favors before he had received them, and had betrayed her. However, she still appeared strange, and having, it may be supposed, conquered her modesty so far as to make a promise or appointment to sacrifice her virtue to him, that she might the easier conquer the surprise, she seemed to slight the intelligence. "But, madam," says the minister, "if you would take my advice—" and there he stopped. "What advice, sir?" says she. "I don't understand what you mean." "Why, I would advise you to return to the town again, and not run into the way of mischief." She still withstood, and put him off with the usual answer, "I don't understand you. What do you mean?" and the like. But at last the minister, raising his voice a little like that of a stern reprover, answered, "Come, come, young lady, you cannot conceal your wicked purposes. You have made Mr. Blank an appointment. He prevailed on you last night, and you have now decked yourself up with your ornaments to meet him, and prostitute your virtue, your honor, and your conscience all to his corrupt, vicious appetite. And I know it, you may see that I do. My advice to you is that you go back and break your wicked promise, and repent that you made it. I shall give him the same advice presently." If she was surprised before, she was now confounded, partly with horror at the fact itself, and partly with the shame of its being known. This put her into such confusion, that at first she could not answer a word, but after a while she said, "If you know the gentleman is there, sir, I will not go, especially since you have such hard thoughts of me." And upon saying this, she turns about and goes directly back again, and the minister went from her towards the house. As the farmer lived but a very little way from the place where she had stood talking with him, she looked behind her and saw him go into the house, and the door shut after him. Anyone will naturally suppose, upon her design being frustrated, and being not only disappointed in her wicked pleasures, but exposed and betrayed, as she imagined, by her lover, that she went directly home, and there gave vent to her passions with the utmost rage, and with all the resentment that such base treatment could inspire her with. The gentleman, on the other hand, being extremely disappointed, and not knowing what could be the reason of it, after he had waited a long time, went back to see what was the matter, believing that something had happened very extraordinary. When he came to the house, she lived, it seems, with an aunt whose husband was also dependent upon the young gentleman's father. He inquired for his mistress, but her maid brought him word that she could not be spoken with. This answer not being satisfactory, and having refused to be answered by 2 or 3 more excuses, She at last sent him word plainly that she had nothing to say to him, and that she not only would not see him now, but would never see him more. Surprised with this message, and not able to guess the meaning of it, he goes away, but the next morning writes her a very civil, obliging letter, wherein, among abundance of the usual expressions of lovers, he begs to know what he had done, that he should merit such treatment, and that she would let him into so much at least of the causes of her displeasure as should put him in a way to clear himself, protesting that he knew not the least step he had taken to disoblige her, except in punctually attending her appointment, and having the mortification of sitting 5 hours alone in expectation of her company. In answer to this, she sent him a long letter, full of reproaches for his vile usage of her, drawing her into a sinful, shameful compliance with him, and then exposing her and triumphing over her weakness, making her with one hand the pretended object of his amour, and with the other the sport of his companions. She upbraided him with telling her that he sat 5 hours alone, whereas he had much better company than she could have been, seeing the good doctor, who had admonished her not to expose herself in meeting him, had given him the same good advice that he had done to her, and so had not made so bad a use of his treachery in betraying her as he expected. She concluded with telling him it was her happiness that this came to her knowledge before she had thrown herself into the hands of a traitor, and though he had done her the injustice to boast of her weakness, she thanked God he triumphed when he had gained but half a victory, that she was infinitely beholden to him for her deliverance, and that it was the only obligation he had ever laid upon her. He was so surprised with his answer from his mistress that he could not tell what to make of it, and especially those paragraphs which related to the good doctor's admonishing her, and being in his company, all which, as he had really known nothing of, so he could not guess at the meaning of it. In a word, abundance of letters passed between them, but still she continued using him after the same manner, talked the same style about his betraying her, and that he had acted the very part of the devil, first to tempt and then to accuse. She accused him with the many solicitations and protestations of affection, and appealed to him to testify whether he had made an easy conquest, and whether she had not so long withstood his most incessant assaults, challenged him to tell how long he had courted her, and whether she should have yielded at last but on an honorable capitulation. He protested that he was greatly surprised at the whole affair, understood not one word of it, abhorred the thought of what she charged with, and at last very warmly insisted upon her explaining herself, and that otherwise, as she did him so much injustice, he would do himself justice, for he had heard she had made it too public, and that though he had not done it yet, being tender of her character, yet he could not bear to be treated in this manner, and not know something of the reason of it. At last he pressed her to let him but speak with her, which, with reluctance, she at last consented to, lest she should be exposed. At this interview they began to come to an understanding. She owned that she was coming to the place, but that she saw the minister go in just before her, which made her return back again, but did not tell him a word of her discoursing with the minister on the way. He protested there was no minister came to him, or with him in the house, and afterwards brought the people of the house to testify the same, that he sat all the while in the parlor reading a book, and no creature ever came near him. This greatly alarmed her, and at last, with much importunity, she told him the whole story of her meeting with the doctor in the fields, and in a word, that the doctor told her where she was going, and to whom, that he was there waiting for her, and, which confounded her worse than all, had told her what she was going about, adding that she had made the promise the night before, and that he, meaning the gentleman, had told him so. Nota bene. In this part she was mistaken. The doctor said he had been told of it as soon as she had made the promise, and she, in her surprise, understood that he said the gentleman told him. He was so amazed at this heavy charge, and himself in every part so clear of it, that it was impossible for him to comprehend it. He knew not what to make of it. He was sensible that he had never opened his mouth to anyone about it, that the farmer or any of his family knew not a word of it, only that he was to meet her there, as they had frequently done before, and innocently enough, and he could not suppose she would be so weak as to talk of it herself, so that he was still at a loss to imagine what it could be. A few days furnished him with an opportunity to talk with the minister himself, who came frequently to his father's house, and being one day very free with him, he jested with him for hindering him of 2 or 3 hours' very good company. The doctor answered him he should be very sorry to be guilty of anything so rude, and desired to know how it could be. "Why, doctor," says he, "we were with some friends very merry at such a house," insinuating that there was more in company. "And such a lady," says he, naming her, "was coming to us, and you met her, and persuaded her to go back again." "Sir," says the doctor, "I have only one satisfaction in the whole story, and that is that it cannot be true, as I shall soon satisfy you." "Nay, doctor," says the gentleman, "I don't tell it you of my own knowledge." "No, sir," says the doctor, "and I should not have so little respect as to tell you it was false, if you had told it me of your own knowledge." "But do you assure me," says the gentleman, "that it is not true?" "I do assure you," says the doctor, "upon my word that I know nothing of it." "Why, doctor," says the gentleman, "do you give me your word that you did not meet her in the fields next to Farmer G 's house on the 11th day of the very last month, being August? For I have it down in black and white here." He pulls out his pocketbook and looks for the day of the month. "Not only on that day," says the doctor, "but I never saw her in those fields or any other fields in my life." "Why, you surprise me, doctor," says the gentleman. "It is impossible." "I appeal to the lady herself," says the doctor. "Nay, doctor," says the gentleman, "if you appeal to her, you must be cast, for I will swear she told me so herself." This confounded the doctor for a little while, but he presently recovered himself. "Sir," says he, "I was going to desire of you that we might wait upon Mrs. together, and that I might hear it from herself, but upon recollecting all the circumstances, I am very happy in one thing, namely, that let her say so herself, and 40 ladies more, I can prove to you that it is impossible it should be true." "That will indeed put an end to it all," says the gentleman. "But how can you do that?" "Why, sir," says the doctor, "are you sure she does not give you a wrong day?" "No, no," says the gentleman, "I have reason why it can't be a mistake of the day, for I have a memorandum of the day upon a remarkable occasion." He had set it down in his book upon the occasion of his being disappointed. "And it is not the lady's mistake, then," says the doctor, "for you know women are not always the exactest in their accounts of days nor months, unless it be on worse accounts than what I imagine you were to meet about." "Well, doctor," says the gentleman, "but I am sure of the day, for I have it in my book." "Nay, if it was mistaken for a day or two," says the doctor, "it matters not, for as I said before, I never saw her in the fields in my life, or if I might see her among other people, I am sure I never spoke to her. But besides, sir, I tell you this cannot be true, for I was at London all the last month till the 27th day, so that 'tis impossible." Here the discourse necessarily broke off. The gentleman was loath to discover his surprise, but told him he would inquire farther into it. And upon that he returns immediately back to the lady, and reproaches her a little with forming such a story to pick a quarrel, but did not tell her that he had been with the minister, only, as he might easily know by other circumstances, that the doctor was out of town. He told her that he would not have charged her with such a thing in such harsh terms, if he was not, upon looking back a little into things, come to a certainty that it was not only false, but that it was impossible to be true. They had a long dialogue upon that head, and as he did not presently tell her the circumstances, thinking he had the advantage of her, he jested with her pretty smartly upon it, seemed to laugh, that she should first put the trick upon him, and then tell such a formal story to make it good, to excuse her breach of promise, and that not a word of truth was in it. She received his making a jest of it with disdain, and told him she began now to discover what kind of man she was so near being ruined by, and that she should have been in good hands indeed that could pretend to banter her thus, that she should have been finely used, if the good minister had not been sent from heaven to save her from being doubly undone. In this state of perplexity they both remained, till the young gentleman informed her he could bring the farmer and all his family to prove that the doctor had not been there that day, nor for 5 months before, and the boy should testify that he never saw him, nor opened the door to let him in. "Well, sir," says she, "now you come close to the point. Pray let all this be done, but let me ask you one question. Do you think I know Dr. Blank, our minister?" "Yes, madam," says he, "I believe you know him well enough, and that makes me wonder at you the more." "Well, and do you think my maid Mary knows him?" says she. "Yes," says he, "I believe she does, for she was born in the town." "Well," says she, "then I have one witness of my side. You shall hear what she says." "Why, madam," says he, "was Mary with you?" "You shall hear presently," says she. She rings a little bell, and in comes her maid. "Mistress, Mary, don't you remember you walked out into the fields with me one day last month?" Mary: "What, when you went to Farmer G's, madam, and sent me back again?" Mistress: "Yes. Don't you remember you would have fain gone farther?" Mary: "Yes, madam, I was afraid you should go over the last field alone." Mistress: "But what did I say to you, Mary?" Mary: "Why, you would make me go back. By the same token, we saw our minister, Dr. Blank, coming after us, and you said the doctor would see you safe, and so I came away contented when I saw him." Mistress: "Are you sure 'twas the doctor, Mary?" Mary: "Sure, madam, yes. Why, he spoke to me." Mistress: "What did he say to you?" Mary: "He said, 'How do you do, Mrs. Mary?' and touched his hat just as he used to." "Well, sir," says she, "then you see I was not drunk, neither did I walk in my sleep. If it were convenient, I would send for the doctor this minute, and he should tell you what he said to me." "Convenient or not convenient," says he, "I'll send for him, or go to him, for I am determined to find it out. You shall see I can talk to the doctor, and that before your face, and yet he shall know nothing of the matter about which we were to meet." "I know a little too much of that," says she. "He know nothing of it," smiling. This put him almost out of temper, and he at last added the whole story, and told her that he had talked with the doctor already, and that he solemnly protested he knew nothing of it, and had never seen her or spoken to her for so long a time, naming the time when he spoke last to her. He likewise told her what the doctor said of his having been at London 3 weeks together when this happened. She began to be amazed, and a little confounded at this, but recovering herself, she told him that if the doctor was there himself, she had a direct answer to give him, for she was not a papist, to believe a priest against her own senses. "What answer can you give, madam," says he, "when the doctor shall prove by 20 witnesses, if need were, that he was at London almost 100 miles off all the while?" "Why, my answer would be this, that 'twas either he or the devil." "Well, then it was the devil," says he. "I won't dispute that with you, madam." "No, no," says she, "I can satisfy you that it could not be the devil. I can convince you. You will acknowledge it presently. Do you think the devil would have turned me back again when he knew the dreadful errand I was going on?" "Nay," says he calmly, "I confess that's the best thing you have said yet. Who then could it be?" says he, "for 'tis plain it could not be the doctor." "Then," says she, "it must be some heavenly appearance in the doctor's clothes, for I not only knew his face and his voice, but his very gown, and if it was a good angel, I have the more reason to be thankful that he hindered me from running into the arms of the devil." She then burst into tears. After having this discourse they parted, for he was a little daunted himself. But my story does not end here, for a little while after something happened that explained all the rest. The lady had a visit to pay at a neighbor's house, who lived a little out of the town, only over one small enclosure which she was obliged to cross. Now, as she was going over that enclosure, who should she meet but the doctor again, and she saw him a good while before he came up to her. She was surprised at seeing him, and if she could have avoided him she would, but it was impossible. When he came up to her, he pulled off his hat very courteously, and immediately began to discourse of what he had said to her before, but took no notice at all of its having been denied. "Sir," says she, I have been very ill used upon that day's work. I know it, says he, I know it, repeating the words, but your innocence shall be cleared up, and I will do it myself. Do you be thankful that you escaped the snare. And so, giving her no time to answer, he passed by her without taking any farewell, which being a little particular, made her turn her head to look after him. But though it was in the middle of the field, which was too large for him to be suddenly out of sight, for it was scarcely a second of time, he was gone, and she saw nothing. She was exceedingly surprised and ready to sink into the ground. She was so frightened that she could not help sitting down even upon the grass, for her joints trembled under her, so that she could not stand. It happened that a poor woman from the town came across the close at the juncture, and knowing her, she called to her to come and help her up. She did not tell the woman what had happened to her, but that she was taken with a fit of trembling, and that if she had not sat down she must have fallen down, all which was true. So the poor woman helped her up and led her home, where she continued very ill of the fright for several days. In this time she had a very great desire to see the gentleman, for by what the apparition said to her, she made no doubt but he had seen it too. After some time, he had heard that she was very ill, and thinking what he had said to her might have had some influence upon her so as to hurt her, he resolved to go and see her, for though he had ruffled her pretty much, yet, as he said afterwards, he loved her very well, and the better for so seasonably recovering her virtue and good principles, and much better than he believed he should have done if he had met her at that time at the farmer's house and gained his point. With these kind thoughts he went to visit her, and though she was very ill, yet she would be brought out of her chambers to see him. After some civilities, he frankly told her the reason of his visit, word for word as above, and that he came to cheer her up a little. She thanked him, but told him it was true that it had extremely troubled her to think first how near she had been to her utter ruin, and then how needlessly she had been exposed for it, and that though she had no guilt, as he very well knew, other than that which was in her first wickedly consenting to meet him, yet she had been as much exposed as if she had been really guilty. He protested to her that he never had opened his lips of it to the doctor or anyone else, and that it was his resentment at charging him with it that had made him so angry, and nothing else, for that he scorned anything so base. She told him it was impossible for anyone to believe otherwise before, but that she believed he was satisfied how it all was now, and that something had happened since which had opened her eyes, though it had almost killed her, and she believed he knew something of it too. He wanted to know what it was, for he protested he knew nothing. "What?" says he. "Are there any more mysteries?" She said she could not tell them, because she supposed he would not believe her. He answered he would believe her in everything that he ought to believe. She told him she believed there would be no occasion to tell him, for that she did not doubt but he would be informed the same way that she was, if he was not already. He importuned her earnestly to let him know what it was, and spake with such a serious kind of discourse that she fancied he had seen something too, but it seems he had not. However, he entreated her so much that at last she let him know the whole story, as above related. There is a great deal more belonging to this story, which would be very diverting, and not without its uses too, but as the particular relation does not come within the verge of my knowledge, I cannot vouch all the particulars, at least not sufficiently. However, it is enough to the case in hand. If the apparition came to prevent this poor deluded young lady from prostituting herself to a man that had wheedled her in upon such dishonorable terms, it could not certainly be the devil or any spirit of his class or under his government and direction, for he would never have exhorted her to go back or reproached her with the crime, and prevailed upon her to believe it had been revealed to him by the treachery of her lover. This must be certainly one of those angelic guards which the God of nature, in mercy to mankind, has placed as a detached body of spirits to counteract the devil, prevent the arch-enemy from seducing his creatures, and overwhelming the world with crimes, and a merciful disposition of providence in favor of the gentleman as well as the lady. They that are running the same course of folly would have reason to be very thankful if they were sure to meet with the same kind of disappointment, and would never say it was the devil that told it them. Shepherd's Sermons on Angels. The gentleman, it seems, did not slight the story so much as the lady expected he would, nor did he question the truth of any part of it, for she told it with so much steadiness, always agreeing in every particular, and gave such concurring accounts of the circumstances as to what had happened before, that it was apparently no delusion. Now this apparition, as is said above, could not with any manner of reason be supposed to be the devil, for why should an evil spirit appear to keep any person from doing evil? Why should it assume a real shape, namely, that of a minister in his gown and cassock, and that it was in appearance the very minister of the parish? For all this she constantly affirmed, and two things are natural inferences from it. First, that the appearance was real. Secondly, that it was a good spirit. Let the divines read us lectures upon the nature of spirits, and how far they can or cannot take cognizance of human affairs. That I have nothing to do with here. My business is to observe the matter of fact, viz., that they do come hither, do appear, and are seen, talked to, and conversed with, and that they do come on good errands, and therefore are not likely to be evil spirits or devils. Calmet on apparitions, spectres, etc., 8vo. I shall give another historical relation, which, though no names are mentioned, I have very good authority for the truth of. And we're about to launch into another story here, but we've reached an hour, so we'll save it for the next episode, since we have a lot to reflect on after all these stories. So next time we'll jump into the second part of Chapter 2, then go from there, see what else lies in store for us. Good night.